Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to just rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions, we want you to direct those to the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. That's also where you'll find the chat tab, and this is where we want you to speak with our speakers and let us know if there's anything you wanted to talk about. And finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to see if you're one of our winners. So our topic today is Kubernetes in the enterprise, and I'm joined today by Jared Curtis, Cloud Architect at Everbridge, Justin McCarthy, CTO and co-founder at Strong DM, Steve George, COO at Weaveworks, Bill Lettingham, CEO of Fairwinds, Hasib Budhani, co-founder and CEO of Rafe Systems, Oded David, head of DevOps at CoreLogics, and moderating today's panel is Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer here at TechStrong Group. All of you, thank you so much for being here with us today. Mike, I'm going to let you get us kicked off.
All right, guys, we're here talking about our favorite subject, Kubernetes. We've been talking about it now for, I don't know, let's be generous and say 5 years, probably longer for some of us. And the question that comes to mind is, if I think about where we were, say, a little over a year ago, I would have looked at all the surveys and they would have said 90% of all enterprises have Kubernetes installed. But then once you poke deeper, you would find they have one cluster, and the rest of their stuff is running monolithic and legacy apps, and that was the way the world was a year to 2 years ago. So Bill, let's get started. Is the world changing? Are we starting to see more Kubernetes in production? Are we starting to, dare I say, see possibly fleets of Kubernetes clusters, or is that a little too far to be worried about? Where are we on this adventure?
Great question, Mike. I think we are seeing progress, but the progress is still somewhat slowed by the fact that Kubernetes, as with any new technology, does present some challenges in terms of how you get it adopted within an organization. And historically, yes, it's been one or two teams within an enterprise kind of kicking the tires, if you will, getting maybe one or two applications into production. Over the last year, we have seen kind of a growth in terms of moving from some of these pilot projects to more widespread adoption. But that in of itself is presenting some new challenges for various teams as they try to get some consistency across multiple dev teams deploying into multiple clusters. That in itself is now presenting kind of a second wave of challenges that I think companies are starting to grapple with. So net, yeah, with any new technology, the growth is always a little bit slower than the hype cycle would suggest, but we are starting to see traction across more and more organizations. And certainly some organizations have now embraced Kubernetes kind of whole hog, if you will, where they do have multiple teams, multiple clusters, and really are using it as the platform du jour for how they're rolling out new applications.
Hasib, let me ask you, is this wicked fast for enterprises? I mean, because this rate at which enterprise IT organizations have moved has historically been pretty slow, at least by the expectations of all the hype cycles and things that are going on out there. So maybe we are just moving faster, and enterprises by definition are just not going to move that quick. And no matter how cool something is, it just takes time. And do we have to have some perspective?
Yeah. By the way, on your question before about all the surveys saying everybody's doing Kubernetes, maybe it's because us vendors are running the surveys and they're all a little biased maybe. Everything takes time in IT, right? And for good cause, right? My thinking on IT, and I tell my team this, Developers are like Congress, IT is like the Senate, right? It's supposed to go slow because it's making some very big decisions for an enterprise, right? They're looking at any decision and they're thinking, well, this is going to impact my business for the next 10 years, right? So let me get everything right versus jump in and start doing things. But then at the same time, developers have to jump in, right? Without developers trying new things out, breaking things, right? There's never going to be experimentation, and we really shouldn't expect true experimentation to come from IT. Look, our entire business model is we're making a bet that people will have many, many clusters, and business is booming, right? So the world is clearly, as exactly like Bill said, right? Something has changed. You and I have talked about this before. I don't know what's changed, but something has changed in the last year to 18 months, and people are indeed bringing multiple teams onto Kubernetes, and that is forcing IT to step back and think about, well, I have to now support multiple development shops within my broader enterprise, and I got to do it the right way. I got to think about the right governance, etc. IT is, I think, being forced to move a lot faster than they may have the luxury of doing in other cases, because developers are not going to wait. They're going to give you enough time to do the right thing, and then they're going to move on and do it themselves, right? And that is short term, that's good for that development organization. Long term is bad for the business, right? There's not a good use of any business's time that developers are working on infrastructure. They should write their apps, and infrastructure should be taken care of by infrastructure or IT people. And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer in organizations. And one kind of data point as to why I say that is because in pretty much every large or mid to large enterprise I talk to, there's now a platform organization within broader IT. That's a good sign. It's a very, very good sign that large enterprises are looking at this as I need to solve this problem for my application team number one versus I need to solve this for the entire enterprise. So I think, this confluence of developers really needing to move fast because their app needs to go out or they're going to keep going on their own pace. And the fact that so many different internal teams are doing it is forcing IT in a very positive way to move at a pace that perhaps they haven't moved at before, which is good for the entire industry.
Hey, Justin, do you agree with that? Because we've been hearing about the wonders of the shift left and full stack developers, and these developers are going to manage everything on an end-to-end basis by themselves and complete ownership. And maybe there isn't a role for an IT ops team using graphical tools in that context, or are we starting to find some middle ground here?
Sure. So let's say, so if the the more you shift left, Kubernetes isn't the end of the shift left either. So if that's your strategy, get ready to adopt even more stuff pretty regularly. I think back to Azim's example, the development teams are going to be yielding these new approaches perhaps more frequently than you can standardize them. So I would say that what we've observed among our customers, again at StrongDM, mostly we're about access to all of these resources. We're seeing kind of maybe last year was very heavily inflected with Kubernetes, and but maybe this year it's a little more balanced. So not everything, for example, coercing a serverless workload into Kubernetes would no longer be like a goal that we'd hear, right? Because if something has a strong serverless shape, it should just use what the native serverless functions in whatever the deployment and runtime environments are. And then similarly, if you have a great persistent database platform out there, maybe you don't need to try and coerce that into Kubernetes as well. So I think achieving steady state where Kubernetes is one of the tools is that's what those have been the themes of the conversations I've been in lately.
Hey, Steve, let me ask you about developers here for a minute, because I find that there's a certain amount of irony in the conversation. Originally, developers were the ones who showed up and said, Kubernetes is the coolest thing on the block and you should use this. Yep. And then just recently, it seems like IT ops teams have wrapped their heads around Kubernetes and they're saying, hey, this is great because we can scale up and down. The cloud resources are more efficient and we gain a lot more operational control. And now they're turning around to the rest of the developer community and saying, thou shalt use Kubernetes. And the rest of the developer community is going, say what? So what is the conversation here about? Is there a great bulk of developers still that don't get Kubernetes, and that's going to be a challenge for enterprise organizations in terms of bringing them along.
I think that's part of the interesting thing about how enterprises are really adopting Kubernetes is there isn't just one way to do it. And in part, this is to do with the question we were just referring to, like different development teams and different setups have different needs. So from a developer perspective, there are certain things that are really exciting about Kubernetes, but the least attractive thing about Kubernetes is how complicated it is. So really what most development teams want is the ability to deploy their application and get on with their lives, get focused on the next feature, the next capabilities. But this kind of, developer toil that can come about with, a Kubernetes platform, because Kubernetes' strength is its composability, but its weakness is its composability. And so what you see is this kind of dual push and pull going on where developers are often excited about Kubernetes, but they also then discover a lot of toil in composing a platform that will work in their setup, which is exactly why we're seeing, as Haseeb said, platform teams being formed, which is fundamentally the idea of taking this, building a platform for the developers, building the workflows from developers away from them because it's not good use of their time or they don't want to do it, and then making that tooling standardized across the enterprise. So you do see in these larger enterprises that idea. But I think it's a really interesting because everybody is trying to get simple user workflows. That's what Weaveworks is all about with GitOps. But ultimately, you've got this need from enterprises, which is very complex, which is what the IT ops teams see.
All right. Dan, do you agree with that? Do you think that in some ways the IT operations guys are kind of laughing up their sleeves a little bit because they're realizing the developers are saying, hey, maybe I don't want to spend all my time managing these platforms because I got to do this thing called writing code, right?
So I see things a bit differently. I think that Kubernetes was built on a specific mindset, and this mindset is divided to a toolkit that was used by developers, but is the adoption and the fit to organization starting to become more real. Now it is also including toolkit that is relevant to operations, stability, availability, scaling, and so on. And what I see now is that basically operation teams, and this is why you need platform teams in the end, becoming more fond and more adoptive to Kubernetes because they understand the mindset. They see the toolkit that it's now fitting to their needs. And they know, okay, now when I have an organization that was built on a different mindset or a mindset that basically affects its culture, can do maybe the hard lifting, but can do the work that is needed to adopt this technology. And when it arrives to the IT people, then the technology is being adopted because they can see the entire organization, how they can see security inside it, how they can see operation inside it, where comes developers. This is something that platform is doing the gap between those old teams and provide the culture, but giving the IT the tools and what they need in order to really adopt it and make it more central for organizations, especially like this.
Jared, do you agree with that? One of our attendees here is saying that full stack DevOps engineer / developer has always been a quote unquote pipe dream. Is this a unicorn that we are never going to see?
Well, I'm sure there's a few out there. I know a few, but for the general person, probably not, right? Like that's a tall order to be able to handle any task that's given to you, develop a scalable backend infrastructure while, writing a user-friendly, gorgeous UI. There are lots of different tasks and lots of different skill sets.
Haseeb, who's managing the platforms these days versus the applications? And is there some distinction here that we can make in terms of where separation of concern should be between the platform and the applications and how we approach that? Is there another way of thinking about this?
Look, something that I've kind of thought about a lot. So, I don't know, 18 months ago, I thought that this idea of a platform organization would be that they would take care of the infrastructure, so the clusters, governance of the clusters, who somebody needs a cluster, somebody needs a namespace, I want to give them this type of access, etc. And then in addition, they would also solve for the application layer. So they're going to have strong opinions on how people deploy applications, whether they're going to use Flux or Argo or whatever. It's not working out that way for the most part, Mike. So what I'm seeing is there's a clear line of separation between what platform teams do and then separately what opinions application teams have. So platform teams seem to have strong opinion on, for example, what are all the add-ons that should run in a cluster? And they sort of kind of stop at that general area. When it comes to application deployment, developers have very, very strong opinions on how they will deploy. And as an example, so there's one of our customers happens to be this very large like health sciences company. And when they chose our product, one of the things they really wanted to do was they said, well, first they qualified our platform for the infrastructure layer, how to provision clusters, govern, the right security, et cetera. And then when it came to application deployment, they tested 3 platforms. So they tested Argo, they tested Flux, and they tested, we have our own kind of GitOps simplistic methodology. They tested all 3. And the reason why they did that is because they said, look, I don't know what method the app team will choose, and I'm not going to force them into any one path. So I'm going to test multiple things, and I'm going to give them options. Infrastructure layer, Kubernetes, and add-ons, my job. Above the add-ons, the applications, I don't care. So long as there's the right governance, have the right visibility, the right monitoring, do what you need to do. And I think that probably is actually a very healthy kind of line in the sand between what platform teams should do and application teams should not so much enforce, but have strong opinions on. So this I'm seeing happen, Mike, consistently across every large enterprise I see.
Hey, Bill, there is, of course, a third choice, right, between the developers and the IT. There's these folks called managed service providers, of which you are one. Are you seeing kind of a shift where people are saying, hey, I just want to write the code, you guys manage the platforms, or is there some sort of middle ground where it's co-managed between you and, say, an internal IT team, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly kind of provide managed services and kind of, try to draw a line between infrastructure and the application layer. But the reality is it tends to be a little bit more complex than that. Certainly the platform engineering teams, the SREs, the DevOps engineers, they're tasked with keeping the infrastructure up and going. However, they're also challenged with, not just managing the infrastructure, but making sure the applications are configured correctly to run in the infrastructure, and that the applications are secure, they're scalable, they're reliable, et cetera. So that's where you tend to see a blurring between the lines where it would be great if, application developers could just, build the microservices, containerize them and hand them off to the platform engineering teams. The reality is it's not quite that simple, and you need to put guardrails in place to ensure that you're doing things in a secure, reliable, scalable, cost-efficient manner. And that's where there's, a blurring of the line between the two, if that makes sense.
All right. Hey, Jared, you're nodding your head there, so I'm going to ask this question to you. Do we need some other form of abstraction sitting on top of Kubernetes? As the guys who built it back in the day said, Kubernetes is a platform for building other platforms, and maybe we're starting to see a few of those. And maybe at the end of the day, we may not even touch Kubernetes because there'll be something between us and them. And what does that look like?
I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but I think that's one of the powers of Kubernetes, right? Is the fact that you already have a defined API with lots of good little pieces you can just stick onto your abstractions and build. I think some earlier said composable, right? You can just compose the application you need. You can abstract away your provider, whether that's your private cloud, public cloud. You can abstract away all those features and just provide them as an API that's easily consumable. And I think that's the right path, right? This kind of gets us going down that dream where developers can deploy an application. And when they deploy an application, they get a VLAN, they get a database, right? They don't have to think about all the trouble tickets and all the support cases they have to open up to get these resources that they're used to.
Yeah. Dan, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think we should be looking to give people especially developers, something else that just says, hey, Kubernetes is underneath there somewhere, but you don't really need to know anything about it.
So yeah, and here I think that the platform team responsibility comes in. Platform in the end responsible for giving the business logic perspective to operation and application. Something that operation by itself cannot see, and an application by itself having our time to sit beside the product roadmap. Today, in any system, the operation side is part of the application, especially if you go to a distributed system, to the cloud. Having said that, in the end of the day, the abstraction is irrelevant for the developer. It means that it needs to see the business logic and deploy to Kubernetes, and it doesn't really care if Kubernetes runs on cluster A or B or C or D or whatever. It doesn't really care about scale, because there are systems that take care of it automatically. It doesn't really care about cloud, because again, Kubernetes gives you the abstraction of the cloud that is needed. So by the end of the day, yeah, abstraction is something that should be done in order to separate developers from the infrastructure, which is Kubernetes in this case.
All right, Steve, do you agree with that? You see the same thing happening over time? We're just going to kind of reduce the complexity because I'm not going to mess around with those lower level APIs any more than I do in some other platforms.
Well, I think if you spin back to the first question, where are people adopting, or what is preventing them from adopting? We've seen this concept before in stuff like PaaS, and what prevented it with PaaS was that there just one size didn't fit all different applications. And in many ways, what we're seeing with Kubernetes and what Jared was saying, it's a platform for building other platforms. It doesn't necessarily have the concept of a particular application built in. And in part what Oded is saying, really what you see with teams is that for them, sure, containers are important, Kubernetes is important for running those applications, but they also have data, they also have ingress, they have other network requirements. So in order to really bring applications to the table as a fully cloud native capability, you actually have to build a platform that's going to work for your enterprise. So you can abstract away from developers a set of those concerns, but individual enterprises may be subtly different. So it won't be the same singular platform across every single enterprise. Different enterprises will pick different components, different APIs, different sets of technology to meet their needs. And I think that's where we're going over the next couple of years, and that's going to enable a richer set of applications.
All right. Justin, one of the things you do hear a lot about Kubernetes is that there's too many bells and whistles, and it was built by engineers for engineers. So do we need to just take a giant step back and say, how do we come up with instances of Kubernetes that have this level of abstraction that are designed for mere mortals, people who are just IT administrators that have graphical tools at their disposal, but they're never going to be programming geniuses. I talked to one of them. He said, for crying out loud, if I knew how to program, I wouldn't be an ops in the first place.
Yeah, I think too many bells and whistles. You could say that of Intel chips. You could say that of the Linux kernel. You could say that of the surface area of the AWS API. And yet the reason why we're able to use all these is because someone on your team is interested in those details. And someone on your team has taken that machine code in the Intel chip, and they've maybe allowed you to address that with some C#, let's say. So I think there's always going to be a member of your team that is interested in the details of Kubernetes. And whether you call it a platform team, whether it's the clever and competent use of another sort of platform building technology, I think actually not having a very impermeable barrier between the developers on your team and those people who are interested in the operation of Kubernetes, I think that's the key, right? So being able to create those abstractions in a way that's tailored to your enterprise and be able to use them, and not just throw your hands up because assembly's hard, or Linux kernel has a lot of features, or Kubernetes has a lot of features. It's true of everything, right? There's no public cloud provider that you would ever print out the manual and say, this looks easy.
Now, see, we're talking a lot about Kubernetes here, but when I talk to some folks too, they're like, hey, the stack of stuff that goes on top of Kubernetes that you were talking about is as more complicated or just as difficult as the underlying platform itself. So do we need to not only think about abstracting away the complexity of Kubernetes, but also everything that sits on top of that we need to deploy that business logic? Because, if I look at something like Prometheus, that's not much simpler than Kubernetes in my mind.
Yeah, the funny thing is, how often does a typical enterprise upgrade Kubernetes a year? By the way, it's 2, best case 2. But then you have, I don't know, depending on the company, we have a crazy customer, it's a financial services company. They have 74 add-ons on Kubernetes before their applications show up. And then each of these add-ons, Mike, it has its own life cycle. They all change whenever the hell they want, right? Because you're buying it from who knows who. And then they have their own configuration management. And oh my God, this is really hard, right? So the Kubernetes part is like a 2-year-old problem, right? That's like enough people can do this. Building a cluster is not, nobody's paying for building a cluster. It's free. It exists. It's in Amazon. It's in Azure. It's free. It's the add-on management that becomes a massive challenge for enterprises before the applications even show up. And then, of course, the applications show up and they happen to have their own life cycles. I always, and you and I've talked about this before, I sort of see Kubernetes as like 4 layers, or at least a system that runs Kubernetes is 4 layers. There's the storage and the networking, then there's the actual Kubernetes layer, then there's the add-ons, and then there's the application. And more and more, at least in conversations with the customers who are looking for a solution to solve their problems, the fact that a platform like ours can help them provision a cluster or upgrade a cluster is sort of nice. Nobody cares, right? It's a solved problem. What they're more focused on is, how do I manage my add-ons? How do I kind of go above and manage lifecycle of my cluster? And then on top of that, how do I make sure all my clusters, if I have n number of them, because people have them, many of them, how do I know they look the same? And then today I installed a cluster and I installed whatever these 74 different add-ons. Great. How do I know they all look the same a month from today? This is actually where more fun work happens, right? So this is where churn is, right? The churn is later. It's not there. You can always write a Terraform script to deploy anything, but then a month from now, how do you know it didn't drift from what you thought it's going to be? I find that these are the kind of the today challenges that platform teams are solving for. And yeah, man, it's actually a hard problem to solve. Good news is, and this is the good news, I think there's some really cool solutions out there in the market that solve these problems now. Veev has great solutions. We have a really elegant blueprint management solution. So there's enough options out there now. Look, I mean, when there's a vacuum, somebody will fill it. So platform teams have expressed that there is a vacuum, which is, hey, Kubernetes, and then the blueprints, add-ons, and then the application, et cetera. I need to manage all of this stuff. So companies are popping up to solve these problems from an enterprise perspective, not like a tooling perspective, but truly enterprise perspective. And some of them are here on this call today. So good news for all of us.
Jared, do you think we have any hope of automating this more than we do today? I mean, the whole point of DevOps in a lot of ways is it's the belief in ruthless automation. And this seems like a clear example of something we should be thinking about automating. And what does that look like?
No, it's completely impossible. Can't automate anything. No, of course. And that's the whole goal, right? Kubernetes itself, there's all kinds of self-managed automation. And there's a whole, like Haseeb was saying, there's a whole industry now of ranchers and OpenShifts and all these various companies are building tools, deployment platforms, all these pieces, right? Like they have the installer, right? For get yourself a cluster, click a button. And so I think, we're going to keep pushing this down and we're going to be able to automate the whole thing. There's people who are going to need to dip down real low to solve the hard problems, but for the day-to-day stuff, I think a lot of it's going to be able to handle a GUI or a simple automation script that gets you pretty close to what you need to be for at least for day-to-day operation.
Hey, Bill, we hear a lot about operators these days, and every product that I talk to in this space, every vendor has possibly 1, possibly 3 operators that they're offering for each of their offerings. And plus the open source community has written their own operators, and other people have operators that combine multiple products underneath the same operator framework. So now my operators have operators. do you think that this is the way we're going to go, or do you think that somehow or other we need to think about some Uber operator that will span all this stuff, or how many operators do I ultimately need?
I think a little bit of that goes back to the question around tooling and automation, and how do you kind of manage all the complexity and all the moving parts. And I think it's going to be a combination of things where, as Jared was pointing out, there's a lot of kind of great solutions already existing in the marketplace, a lot of good open source tooling that helps with this problem of doing things like managing add-ons. In particular, we have released an open source project that makes it easier for SREs to track deprecated APIs within a cluster, which becomes a challenge as you're trying to add, or manage more and more add-ons within your environment. So, end of the day, without automation, this is, a complex problem that is a little too hard to manage. And so we'll boil down to what tooling, what automation do you have in place? How do you get consistency from one environment to the next? And the only way to frankly do that is through automation.
All right. Let's see, do you see the same thing happening? Or are we going to get to the point where maybe I can just say what I want the thing to do and it will just magically happen, and I won't be sitting here trying to figure out all these little low-level APIs and operators and what goes with what?
Well, we'll sell you a helmet and you can just kind of think it. It's going to happen. Look, automation's come a long way. Not that this is a plug for any of our companies, but the entire business model here is we're telling people, hey, you don't need to hire people with like massive Kubernetes skill sets because they don't exist anyway. And we can enable your IT team to actually move significantly faster without learning Kubernetes. And the way you do that is in complete automation. Right? And so I'm familiar with the automation framework that Bill mentioned that came out of Fairman. It's really elegant, right? They've done a great job. But there's so many options out there for this now that frankly, there's not a whole lot of excuse. I mean, the one thing I think about a lot is 3, 4, 5 years ago, when tooling didn't exist as much as it does now, it was a competitive advantage to basically build automation in-house, right? Because your competitors they didn't know what they were doing. So if you could automate and you could move faster than your competitors, well, you're going to be better off. You're going to win your industry, whatever industry you happen to be. I think the world has changed now. So I think now all your competitors are buying from people like us or Rancher or Weave, right? So now it's actually, arguably, it's a competitive disadvantage if you're trying to build all this stuff in-house. Because, man, go focus on your apps. Why are you wasting your time building stuff when you can buy automation? Automation exists now. And there's some really good solutions out there, right? I think that's the big difference, right? There's this cottage industry of people meeting up at KubeCon and writing small little projects and then, putting them on GitHub.com. It's gone from that to, man, the average deal size are large because it's a big problem, right? Essentially, what are we selling but automation? What is the job here? What do I do all day? I sell automation. That's it. That's fundamentally it, right? And it's automation like this or Weave or Fairwinds or Rancher that is enabling enterprises to move at the pace that they want it to, right? And look, I mean, of course, we're all biased here because we're all vendors, but I'm very convinced that what we thought Kubernetes would be in 2018 is here now, right? The pace at which enterprises are doing this, I mean, it's just actually fascinating. 2-3 years ago, the best case conversation I would have would be with like a DevOps manager, like in a company. Now, like this morning, I talked to a very large financial services company. I talked to their CTO, and he said to me, you know what he said to me? He said, you know what? I mean, my team's using a product, but I've actually never seen it. Can I see a demo? This guy cares, right? Because the world has shifted. In his mind, this is so important that he's going to take time with me and watch a demo of our product. Versus I'm sure 2 years ago, he's like, whatever, DevOps people will figure this out for me. The world has changed because of automation.
Steve, speaking of the world changing, we've been, banging the door on this DevOps thing for the better part of a decade now. And truth be told, most people are doing continuous integration and very few are doing the continuous delivery side of that equation because most of the platforms are unique and they're all snowflakes. But Kubernetes presents more of a standardized set of APIs. So is one of the outcomes here of this shift to Kubernetes is that we're going to see more people adopt what folks are calling GitOps, where basically I am automating the configuration of the platform within the Git repository and shipping that out along with my application code. And will that change the way people think about not only managing Kubernetes in the enterprise, but their whole application delivery strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. I think at core, one of the things that Kubernetes changes, and it's easy to forget this when we live it all day long, but APIs for things in the whole of the pipeline, that's actually pretty fundamentally different. And declarative systems that can take that and then an extensible API that you can use, so the operator patterns, like this is a fundamental difference from previous kind of levels of technology that we've been working on. And that's going to enable and is enabling people to automate so much more of their deployment pipeline, so much more of their operations pipeline, because all developers, all operators, at all stage of the deployment can now use the same APIs, see the same code being deployed, and write automation that tells us this difference between what we think is we're being deployed and what is actually deployed. And that's a fundamental difference. When we talk about GitOps, we often talk about deployment, but I think the operating part of GitOps is going to be just as important, because being able to automate what is happening, resolve issues automatically, I mean, there's a whole hinterland of opportunity there for teams and vendors, because honestly, that is not work that anybody wakes up in the morning going, oh yeah, absolutely, what I want to do now is spend the next 6 hours trying to debug why some deployment went bad and figure out what's happening across 6 different tabs. So I think, really the operations part, Kubernetes is going to open that up to all sorts of different technologies. And then even going beyond Kubernetes, applying the same concepts of declarative APIs to other areas, databases, the data layer, network ingress, all of that. So taking GitOps to that whole application stack will I think, over the next few years, see some really interesting things happening.
All right. Dan, do you agree with that? And is that something that people get out of the bed in the morning and say, I'm going to go get me some GitOps? Or is that something that I wake up one day and say, hey, look, Mom, I'm doing GitOps?
Okay, so GitOps basically is another method of distributed system and allowing the developers to have an interface to see the configuration of the structure. In the past, you would put everything in a database, build a nice UI, provide the entire organization or the R&D teams an access to watch how things looks like. It was in their IT mindset, it was not clear to the developer what there is there, what it needed, and so on. Today, the Kubernetes basically allows you to have an interface that is GitOps. One interface is to put everything under the etcd as a database, like it used to be. You can run commands of kubectl and see whatever you need. More for the operating side, more for people that are infrastructure based, even for developers in some levels. But you have the other side, which is how do I expose it to developers in a way that they need and they work. They have their IDE, it's connected to GitHub or Git or GitLab or whatever, and they see the entire configuration that they need with the interface that they need. So I think that Kubernetes enhances GitOps, but it's not the reason for GitOps.
No. Hey, Justin, we have not talked about security. And the issue that you see in many organizations is it takes a while for the security team to wrap their heads around a new platform, and they always seem to be trailing behind. And is that in some ways slowing adoption of not only Kubernetes, but things like GitOps? I mean, we have DevSecOps, so are we going to need GitSecOps? Is that what comes next, or where are we going with this?
Let me address that generally. So I think governance and security both have an interest in very understandable, explainable facts about any deployed environment. Where are the sensitive bytes that we're protecting right now? Who has access to them right now? Who had access to them yesterday? Okay, and so there is this interesting tension between any amount where we turn up the dial on ephemerality elasticity, scalability, right? That competes with that explainability. Okay, so so I would just say, like, fundamentally, more powerful is going to mean you're going to have to think about how you're going to explain this whole story at audit time. Okay. And I do think that that's one of the major distinctions between, I know I've never been in a sprint planning meeting where the end of the sprint planning session has a let's simulate an audit like phase to it, as in every sprint. But if it did, I think we might end up with, some, maybe even some different shapes of operators and maybe even some different shapes of YAML files to bring that into your consciousness as you're shaping the application and building the application. So anyway, so that's what I would say. You can't get away from it, and if your organization isn't performing an audit, maybe because you don't have to, finding a way to synthetically do so is probably a good idea.
All right. Hey, Jared, do you agree with that? And maybe could you take a stab at what Justin asked from us, essentially, is how would you explain Kubernetes and the cloud native architecture stack to somebody in security in a way that they can understand? Because I'm sure that a lot of the people who are in the enterprise today are having those conversations.
Well, thanks, Mike, for putting me on the spot there. And boil us all down to a simple topic. All right. So yeah, in general, what Justin was saying there, I agree with. It's good for teams to consider the security implications of everything they're doing. And I would challenge teams to actually do this audit task, right? Like, find a simple piece of an audit you're either part of, and just like, hey, by the way, in this sprint, I want to see the logs for this, right? Like, let's make sure that kind of stuff. That's always something good to think about. But how would I boil this down for a security team? I would probably start off and just say, like, let's just pretend this Kubernetes thing, it's a set of APIs, right? It's no different than the APIs for your cloud vendor, except maybe if we're running it, of course. But you have all your VMs, you have all your nodes, they're running containers, they're running orchestration, and we're presenting a very robust set of APIs that we can interact with. What kind of tasks are we given here to secure this? Well, we have role-based access control. That's native to the platform. We have network policies. Those are native to the platform, right? These are things that, those are your firewall rules. These are your access control lists. We have all these things already built in there. So it's probably my poor attempt at boiling that down.
All right, no worries.
I think one of the things that, just on the security front, one of the things that the concept of GitOps does for you is this: one of the participants has put in the fact that they're finding that in the wild that only about 50% of APIs are managed. And I think this is something that comes across from enterprise after enterprise after enterprise, where you talk to them and you discover, when you look at the systems in production, there are often systems running in production which are not proactively being managed. And so by having something which is determining everything which is deployed through the same pipeline, and then being able to audit the fact that the production environment is the same as what you intended, this is, I think, a really big deal for understanding what you're actually deploying into production, and therefore being both secure and auditable.
Yeah. Hey, Bill.
Yeah. One more thing about it, sorry.
Go ahead.
It's now in the latest version, putting really hard on security. They're adding features, they're adding functionalities that are cross-organization, that basically aim to the security teams and to what calls the DevSecOps.
All right. Well, that kind of leads into the next question. Bill, you were king for the day. You can have the Kubernetes community will do anything you say. What's at the top of that list that would make your life easier?
Oh, God. That's a tough one. No, I think it's just, continuing to move in the direction we're going, i.e., making sure that you understand how all the pieces go together and can have tooling that supports your ability to get visibility across the DevOps chain and give feedback to those team members that need to know kind of how all the pieces get put together. I.e., how do you give meaningful, actionable information back to the developers so that they can do the things correctly from a security perspective, et cetera, as they build the applications to get deployed into Kubernetes. So it's just continuing to raise awareness across the organization, dev, sec, ops, giving visibility to those teams so that they can all work together and do their jobs more efficiently. Because that's, kind of a repeated challenge that we see in organizations. While they talk about DevSecOps, the reality is there's still very disparate teams within many organizations with kind of pockets of knowledge, but not universal knowledge of all the moving parts and what's really required to make everything come together correctly.
All right, Steve, you live in a country that still has royalty, so what would you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I worked in the Linux world for a long time. I suspect that one of the things we've been talking about a few times here is the fact that applications and other processes, there's not a lot of differentiation between them. I suspect that one of the things that will happen in the Kubernetes world over the next period of time is that the scheduler will get more complicated. And I think Justin referred to it at one point, like no longer do people who deploy Linux really craft or hand look after their own schedulers, but there certainly was a time phase in the Linux world where we used to do that. And I think in order for Kubernetes to continue to grow as a platform, the scheduler and the scheduler capabilities around that, like the ability to write lightweight VMs and run lightweight VMs within those kind of environments, I think that will have to broaden out so that we can meet more different sorts of workloads.
Now, Steve, you got anything on your mind that you would like to see?
No, I mean, generally agree with the conversation going on so far. But on the security part, I'm thinking out loud. Maybe 2 years ago, I wonder if security really cared about Kubernetes, right? It was sort of kind of happening in a corner somewhere. And now it's not the case, right? So any deal that closes for us, I find that there's sort of 4 constituencies that must sign off, otherwise, platform-wide adoption doesn't happen. So there's SRE, there's developers/DevOps, there's sort of compliance and governance, and then there's security. And what security is focused on is runtime security, sort of supply chain security, and they're focused on like the kinds of things that Justin and team work on, like access management, et cetera. Right? So this seems like it's becoming a pretty standard ask now. I think people are figuring out what is security's role in Kubernetes land, and how it is different from governance and compliance. So I think this is also a sign of maturity, right? If security is showing up and they have strong opinions on certain things in any space, that's always a sign of maturity, right? So kind of stepping back from the things we sell, these are the things I try to kind of look for. And definitely, I'm actually really happy to see that, in any kind of new engagement that kicks off for us, like if we start like a POV with a customer, now more and more they're saying, well, before we do this, our security team has these questions for you. That's really good. It's really positive. Right? It means good things for the industry. I think it's just, every time you and I talk, we talk about how I keep saying the same things to you, right? Something has changed. I still don't know what has changed, but something indeed has changed. And in whether it's security, whether how people think about this, whether it's about automation, all things seem to be moving in the right direction for this industry.
All right, well, let's get on to that for a minute. Justin, what's your best advice to folks in the enterprise about how to accelerate that journey? Let's assume that everybody's on it at some level. It's just that maybe still early stages. And how do we get from the point where, I've got 1s and 2s to 10s and 100s?
Yep. Okay. So if your goal is acceleration, I would maybe paradoxically say that forcing adoption isn't the approach. So instead, make it easy to continue to use. Let's say you're an Azure shop and you're not working primarily in AKS, and so you have a happy path already to deploy, let's say, VMs. Make the AKS side of the experience more and more desirable every day, and then the point at which you have 51% of your workload flowing over to the AKS side, then it's a candidate for maybe being more forceful in your policies about how to deploy. But if your goal is speed, just make it appealing. And I think the key thing is to, not make it appealing by just doing the off-the-shelf version, make it appealing for the shape of your organization and for your culture. And I think that's imminently possible with the tools that are out there.
All right, Jared, got any other thoughts beyond better carrots and smaller sticks, I guess? I don't know what Justin was saying there, but that's how I got out of it.
No, actually, I really like that approach there. I'm just going to agree with him. It's like, if we really want people to adopt this platform, you make this platform usable and you make it really nice. So it's like, oh, before you want to deploy monitoring, you have to deploy your monitoring VM. You have to deploy this and that and all these other pieces. Well, now in Kubernetes, it's like, oh, well, here's this YAML file. You just dump it over there and you get your whole stack, right? Like it's all transparent to you. You as the developer of the deployment team, you're just caring about less. And if you can get to that point, you're going to have more development and more drive to going towards your Kubernetes platform.
All right. Dad, what do you think? I mean, do I need to get the developers to push, or is there some sort of middle ground and maybe we can have a kumbaya moment here between the ops guys and the developers and figure this out together?
So I think it goes to that direction. And again, you need some kind of a team in the middle because there is long history between ops and dev, and trying to communicate it requires different thinking. What I see, by the way, is the issue with Kubernetes or things that are important to Kubernetes is the idea behind Kubernetes is basically unify the entire organization. Observability is going to be a key factor for that because unifying organization means that I'm using the same cluster or multiple clusters for both my infrastructure application, my applications, and so on. And I think that everybody will need to work together in order to achieve it. Unify everything to have one common language that is basically abstract from what we used to know.
Steve, are you finding any way that people are starting to work together better? I mean, am I still just throwing everybody in a room and locking the door until we see what comes out? Or is there, some more mature behavior starting to emerge?
I think I'm seeing maturity for sure. I think so. One of the things that we're seeing happen, and we help with this sort of part of the implementation phase of the sale, is I think one of my colleagues here just talked about this idea that there's a YAML file and it kind of does all the things. I think Jared said that. And so many teams, what they're doing is they're trying to come up with these skeleton YAML files and charts. It's a good sign. In fact, we've kind of taken that on as a burden on us, and we share these things with our customers now. Hey, as you enable your teams to start coming onto Kubernetes, here's some frameworks. Here's a simple application example for this and that and that. This is not a product or anything. This is just stuff you've seen over time, and people can actually kind of pick it up and they take it from here. And what happens is as new teams get onboarded and they are given a landing zone, that's a phrase now that's kind of coming about in the industry. The platform teams are saying, look, if you're going to be a Java shop, if you're a Java shop, here's our best recommendation for best practices. If you're going to be writing code in Go, here's a recommendation for best practice. And by the way, here's an example of a chart that you can start with. And oh, by the way, here's an example of a pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this standardization, which is presently, by the way, it's happening within companies. I'm sure there's a company out there, somebody's going to start that's going to solve that problem too. But the standardization is happening, right? So standardization cannot happen without reasonably good communication between teams and the understanding that if we don't do this together, we're not going to go as fast as we can. So this, Mike, I'm seeing consistently in mid to large enterprises. Like, I mean, in all cases, my opinion and feedback is it's going quite well. The things that we want to see in a new industry, things that should come up together, they seem to be coming together, and this is also a very, very good sign of that.
All right, Bill, do you agree with that? Because sometimes when I talk to folks, they're like, insert curse word, wall of YAML files, put a predicate behind it, and here we are.
No, actually, I do.
That I was talking about. It's exactly.
No, I agree with Haseeb. I mean, the key is really implementing best practices across the organization, which starts as kind of templated YAML files, having a way of scanning the YAML files for those best practices, being able to implement policy as code, and doing other things like that to really help facilitate the process and get that common language going across the different organizations within the company. Yeah, so I do agree that, that is the right approach to drive adoption. As we all know, developers love to start with kind of sample code, sample frameworks. And so whatever you can do to kind of get them going in the right direction to help, apply those best practices, that's going to really speed up the process.
All right, Steve, what are your thoughts? Do we need better frameworks that are essentially guardrails that keep me from spinning too far out of control? And when do you tell somebody not to go play with that because, it's probably going to cause more harm than good?
Yeah, so I think to be slightly controversial, I would say to people, don't start by trying to build a platform. So to really, the whole goal of Kubernetes is to be able to deploy your applications and operate them, faster, better, and with a greater level of control. So I'd say at least initially for people, one of the possible anti-patterns that you see in the enterprise is that with a small amount of information or small level of expertise, they start trying to build the perfect platform by taking in all requirements across the business. And so I've seen some quite large enterprises grind to a halt on this one. So I would sort of generally favor for people a relatively, a small application-centric learning phase to build off what Justin said right at the start. That will get team members and developers interested because they see, some potentially straightforward applications being used in production, being used in anger, and that gets excitement. And then in later phases, you're then talking about, getting to what Hasib and Bill were talking about when you're going across multiple different teams. And then you want to use that templating, use automation. For Weaveworks, we've done a bunch of work around policy as code, which is ultimately this idea that we can enforce standards, we can provide these guardrails, help people not have to know this wall of knowledge, but just automate the enforcement for them. And that really does help you when you're at multiple different teams, deploying multiple different applications. That's a great second phase, I would say.
All right. Gentlemen, last question will go to Hasib, and I'm just throwing this out there for grins, but you can't get out of bed this morning without somebody talking about AI this and AI that. So can we apply AI to the management of Kubernetes going forward? What's real and what's not?
So this is the one question today that I have a negative answer for. I don't know, man. I guess you can apply it. I don't know if I have enough data to apply actual machine learning to any of the problems that we're solving. Yeah, look, people are. I've met companies now, Mike, and this is, I guess, a bit more of a not as a. It's a straightforward answer. Yeah, I've now met companies who are looking at bin packing using AI in Kubernetes. These are interesting ideas, but usually this market is too early for those kinds of applications to make. People talk about optimization and all that. This is all very nice, but the market is still early. Look, we're talking to the reason why we're having this conversation today is that we're really asking the question: is this market early? Right. So when this market is, and the answer is, by the way, yes. Right. It's moving in the right direction, but the market is early.
All right. Cool.
When markets are early, we need to learn. I'm personally learning and being able to apply an AI, ML, machine learning. These things will come later. And when but today, I'm not sure right now.
All right. Well, personally, I'm looking forward to the next round of buzzword bingo, and we'll see where that goes from here. But I got to hand it back to Cody because an hour has flown by as usual before we knew it.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Sorry. Thank you, Mike. And I'd also like to thank Jared, Justin, Steve, Bill, Hasib, and Oded for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that today's session was recorded. You can rewatch on Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. We do have 4 gift cards to give away. Our 4 winners are Maria V, Lizzie H, Zechariah F, and Samuel D. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. And so I would like to thank everyone for being here with us today on this panel. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us for today's program. We do just ask for 1 more minute of your time to fill out a post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen right after we close out. But other than that, I hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar, and Everyone have a great rest of your day.